I don't know about you, but my favorite sequence in any Frankenstein film is the process by which Victor summons his monster to life. In some combination of wizard's library, alchemist's lab, and early modern science, all gleaming with brass instruments buzzing with electricity and the bubbling of some Paracelsian instruments of life. At least that's where my imagination goes when I visit the creation of Frankenstein's monster. But how did Victor bring life to the lifeless, conjure this wretched yet noble creature into existence? In the novel, Mary Shelley depicts Victor Frankenstein as caught between two worlds: the world of occultism, the world of Hermetic philosophy, and the alchemical dreams of his youth, and then, on the other hand, the world of natural philosophy, the cutting-edge science and especially chemistry of his day. And this combination makes for a curious question. Given that combination, especially his potential knowledge of the occult, how might Victor Frankenstein have created his monster? In collaboration with Atun Shea Films, whose video essay on Frankenstein you absolutely have to check out, you can see it in the link below, I want to speculate a bit on just that question. Let's think through how a scientifically minded occultist of the early 19th century might have made a monster. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you want to support work like this of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or some of the cool merch we have here on the channel. But now, let's make a monster. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Alright, I'll be the first to admit that the conceit of this video is something of a betrayal of Mary Shelley's aesthetic choices in Frankenstein. Shelley was a master of the Gothic, that artistic movement of the late 18th and 19th century, in which the sublime existed as a mysterious, alluring, powerful, and seductively violent force that threatened to overwhelm us, human beings, with gloom and shadows, ruin, and our own inner affectivity, our own emotions, our own turmoil. Shelley's world in Frankenstein is one of tortured interiority, vast landscapes, and most of all, dreamy, surreal imagination. And that's why I think she carefully decided not to reveal the process by which the monster comes into lumbering life. That process lurks solely within our imaginations, as it rightly should. By not telling us, the narrative is all the more arresting, all the more frightening. What can be detailed and analyzed is just never as fearful as that which lurks just beyond our ability to imagine it. And in a sense, I want to do just that in this episode. So, with all due apologies to Mary Shelley, I want to take what I know from the history of the occult, and I want to imagine how we could use it to create a monster. And we have some solid grounds to do so from the novel to inform us. We know, for instance, that in his youth, Victor was a keen reader of Agrippa, of Albertus Magnus, and of Paracelsus. Absolute titans of the world of the occult, and that's going to anchor us in history. So let's review each of these in order to get some sense of how they may inform the creation of life from dead matter. Albertus Magnus combined natural philosophy with the occult. He prepared amulets and even attempted to submit proof for philosophical arguments he made from his own summoning of spirits. Despite such admitted criminal necromancy, he would go on to become the teacher of Thomas Aquinas and is now recognized as a doctor of the Catholic Church. At the core of his philosophy was the notion that there were occult forces hidden in nature by God, which could be unlocked and instrumentalized. Specifically, he held that superlunar intelligences actually emit a kind of astral radiation which imbues all of creation with the specific power of those planetary spirits. Mars, for instance, emanates a active, warlike force. The sun rays down life-giving powers, and Saturn radiates his own brooding wisdom. In fact, those forces penetrate into all beings. The solar radiation, for instance, goes deep within the earth and actually pulls seeds upwards with its life-giving rays. Further, Albertus Magnus argues that these rays could be captured and activated, otherwise inert objects. Thus, one could capture that Martian energy, harnessing that militant power in a talisman for war, for instance. Of course, these forces are hidden, hence they are occult, but they can be discovered by the wise adept. But could they be used to animate life from lifeless substance, or even death? I doubt that Albertus Magnus would have gone so far. As a good Catholic, well, mostly good Catholic, God alone is believed to be able to bring things to life and revive the dead. Man, because of his sinful state, no matter his powers over the occult, could never raise the dead or create life, I think would argue by Albertus Magnus. But that's the official story for the, up and up Catholics. But of course, historically, there were other avenues for the daring and the willing. Among the clerics of the Middle Ages, some used their education and their mastery of religious rituals, especially the ritual of exorcism, the driving out of demonic forces from the faithful. They would use those abilities for a forbidden vocation. These priests became necromancers, summoning and binding demons to do their bidding. And it's in some of the surviving manuals of this clerical necromantic underground, as we call it, that we find a shocking bit of sorcery. A spell, or experimenta as the text has it, for reviving the dead, or at least using demons to make them appear alive. In a 15th century manual of demonic magic, the Munich Necromancer's Manual, known more generally as CLM 849, that somehow managed to survive the fires of the Inquisition, we find this spell. One is to take a gold ring and carve into it demonic names on the outside and on the inside. These names are names like Brimmer, Suburith, Tranut, and on the inside you carve names like Lyroth, Baron, and Damin. This ring is then to be placed in running water for 5 days before taking it and placing it, unsurprisingly, in a tomb for Friday and Saturday. Then, in a remote place, one uses a sword to carve a magic circle into the earth and then fill it with various demonic names and sigils. One then conjures all of the demons written upon on that ring in the various cardinal directions, such that when one places the ring upon the finger of a dead person, they will inhabit the body. The demons will conjure the body back to life in a sort of grim marionette. The ring will also make a living person appear as a corpse. Indeed, the necromancer who wrote this spell even details this and informs us, "I have experienced these effects, for I do not mention things that I have not myself experienced." Thus, assuming Victor would go to any length to create a monster, even interacting with the demonic, especially one composed of the classic bodies of the dead stitched together, we have here an example of a historically real demonic magic which could conceivably animate such a stitched together corpse creature. Thus, when we imagine someone like Victor, who's certainly more intelligent than ethical, ghoulishly pillaging tombs, we can also imagine him indulging in a kind of criminal necromancy to create something at least akin to life. Cornelius Agrippa was himself the premier Hermetic philosopher of the first half of the 16th century. He lectured on Kabbalah, he was an adroit alchemist, he defended at least one witch that we know of, and he would go on to prepare the greatest manual in the history of the occult, his famed 3 books of occult philosophy, published originally in 1533. In this work, he details the means by which one could transform nature in a fundamental way through magical means as part of the process of receiving divine illumination. Now, as you might imagine, he was hounded by the Inquisition his entire life, but his works provide the foundation for virtually all aspects of modern occultism. And in that book, in chapter 58 of the first book of occult philosophy, he mentions how even at the moment of death, one can receive a kind of divine vigor, which allows one to survive even one's own mortality, a kind of boon in the face of impending doom. Indeed, aside from something like a swoon or comatose state, the soul of a dying person can be said to hide as he has it, and such people can be said to be in a state of stasis or ecstasy-induced quasi-death. However, they can be revived through various magical and medical means. However, this isn't really creating or bringing life to the lifeless. But Agrippa does contend that as one practices natural, then celestial, and finally divine magic, one does eventually become one with God, restored to the Adamic state, and thus you do acquire God-like divine power, which would include bringing the dead back to life, or perhaps life where there was none before. And this idea, while shocking to Renaissance Christian sensibilities, was actually underwritten by an even more ancient form of mysticism known to Agrippa and the other occultists of his day, known to us now as the Kabbalah. In one of the most brief and enigmatic texts in all of the history of Jewish wisdom, the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation, describes the means by which God created the universe. Using the power of the Hebrew language, God is said to have spoken being into creation. When God said, Yehi Or, let there be light, it was speech that made the light. Thus, in the Kabbalah, language is the fundamental metaphysical building block of reality. And in the Talmud at Masechta Sanhedrin 65b, we're informed that if the righteous wanted to, they could create worlds, olamim, universes. And as an example of just that power, we're told that several rabbis were able to create not only a calf, they created a calf, but also a human being by studying this mysterious Sefer Yetzirah. However, this artificial human being, known typically as a golem, lacked the ability to speak. And some 6 centuries later, after the composition of the Talmud, Eliezer of Worms would compose a commentary for the Sefer Yetzirah, in which we learn how to create such a golem ourselves. This involves ritually purifying yourself, gathering virgin clay from near a river, shaping it into a humanoid form, all the while uttering complex combinations of the letters that compose the Hebrew name for God, Yod, He, Vav, He. In variant legends, we even have the idea that one etches the word emet, truth, onto the forehead of the golem. You animate it, and by erasing the first letter, you transform emet, truth, to met, dead, and thus the creature returns to the clay. Legends abound in Judaism about golems from the history of Kabbalah, from the golem housekeeper of Solomon ibn Gabirol, we could all use a golem housekeeper if we're all honest, to vengeful golems that protected the vulnerable ghettos of Europe. But Victor wasn't Jewish, to my knowledge. He wasn't a Kabbalist, and moreover, these esoteric practices require one to be righteous above all. One thing we know from the novel that Victor was most decidedly not. Indeed, he may very well be the picture of arrogance, recklessness, and irresponsibility. But finally we come to that original punk rock alchemist, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Oenheim, known on the streets as Paracelsus. And as an academic doctor, he would publicly burn the medical manuals of his day in protest of what he took to be idiotic dogma masquerading as wisdom. He would lead a vagabond, tortured existence, and he would lead ultimately also a revolution in alchemy, medicine, and magic, ultimately laying down the fundamental modern ideas of pharmacology and toxicology, noting famously that the dose makes the poison. And in his De Natura Rerum of 1537, he outlines a method for creating an artificial human being, a homunculus. That the sperm of a man be putrefied by itself in a sealed cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb. This is actually to be heated using horse dung, a very common way of heating things with low heat in alchemy, but at least as long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, and this is easily observed. After this time, it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent without a body. And if after this it be fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood, and be nourished up to 40 weeks, and be kept in the even heat of the horse's womb, again, horse dung, a living human child grows therefrom, and with all of its members like another child, which is born of a woman, but much smaller. But how is such a thing even possible, as Paracelsus understands it, to create a artificial child in a jar? Because he holds to the Hermetic principle that reality itself is something like a fractal. All macroforms contain their microforms, which reflect one another. Thus, that which is above is like that which is below, and vice versa. Sperm carries inside of it a little person. Human sperm thus carries the substance and form of a human being, and thus can be caused to grow in a kind of artificial womb of the alchemical flask. And indeed, as been pointed out by Peter Freund, the 40 days or weeks of the period of the gestation of the homunculus mirrors the nearly 2 years that Victor himself labors over the monster. And even the transparency of the artificial human compares to some degree to the watery eyes of his creation. Further, Paracelsus informs us that the homunculus is born of art, and they need not learn art, and are thus born with vast knowledge, even knowledge of the future in some cases. And this also may be connected to the monster's own precocious wisdom, his ease of education, him just out there reading Paradise Lost, and his general erudition. Even the language of pursuing nature to her hiding places echoes the language of Paracelsus. Though, to be clear, Paracelsus is searching for the hidden divine signatures of nature, and Victor is simply as arrogant as he is rapacious. Thus, Paracelsus, who looms large in the novel, does lay out something of a theory of creating an artificial person from basically scratch, from just a seminal drop, growing them, as it were, from that seminal seed. But, as you'll probably remember from the novel, Victor's father dismisses all of these titans of the occult as just sad trash, eschewing the occult for Galvanism, natural philosophy, and chemistry. And for his part, Victor seems to put them behind him when he witnesses a bolt of lightning crash into a tree that is eventually hermetically mirrored, as he notes that he too is a blasted tree with a bolt having entered into his soul. Indeed, his teachers urge him to begin his studies completely anew, having wasted his time on these occult ramblings that, quote, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. But recall that Victor isn't terribly impressed by the science of his day either. In fact, he ultimately ends up skipping some of his chemistry classes, and he, quote, becomes disgusted with natural philosophy. Indeed, he seems caught, as I mentioned in the introduction, between those two worlds, the worlds of medieval occult knowledge and the one of modern science. And also in Shelley's time, we should remember that the very first reports of vampires, creatures dead and buried, were rising out of their graves to attack the living. These reports were now coming from Eastern Europe, and they were being synthesized into the scientific and religious literature of the time, beginning in the mid-18th century. And this idea that the dead were returning, and again, I have to point out that these reports were coming from doctors, military doctors, and who were reporting peasants opening graves, driving stakes through hearts, and incinerating corpses. And the idea that the dead could return to life was a nightmare both to the Catholics, who held that only God could resurrect the dead, and then only at the end of time, but also this was a nightmare for the Enlightenment, because here we had the idea that the natural processes which govern life and death could somehow be perhaps magically overcome. Enlightenment scientists and chemists were horrified of the idea that the dead could return, because it unmade their very elegant and simple mechanical theories that the heart was merely a pump and that this was merely the action of some kind of springs. If the dead could return, and we had reliable reports such as those published by Augustin Calmet, if those reports were reliable, this was a nightmare for both the theologians and for the scientists. And Shelley would have known the rumors coming from the East of the vampire. It's interesting that the vampire, legends of the vampire emerging from the East, may be influencing the rise of what we think of as sort of the rival monster, at least from the classic films. The rival monster of Frankenstein is in some sense Dracula the vampire, and yet it may be the rumors of the vampire that are also animating the idea that the dead could return to life. But the science and the chemistry of the early 19th century were still very much in development, and debates over the nature of life itself were at the core of that development. And by 1814, just 4 years before the composition of the novel, this debate over the life principle came to a head when the vitalist John Abernathy, president of the Royal College of Surgeons, and his pupil William Lawrence, appointed as the second professor at the college in 1815, took up the materialist position. The question at stake was, what were the necessary and sufficient conditions for life itself? Were they material in nature, or was there still some non-material vital substance, perhaps itself tied to a spiritual element which made for life? And the materialists had just had dramatic wind put into their sails by the experiments of Luigi Galvani, who showed that the dead muscle of the leg and spine of a frog could be activated by electricity. Could it be that this animal electricity was the source of life itself? Thus, it's no surprise that most depictions of the creation of Frankenstein's monster use lightning and electricity for his animation. Indeed, the contemporary search for the origins of life, such as the famous experiments of Miller and Urey, which showed that the fundamental building blocks of organic matter could be derived from natural processes and inorganic material using electricity. So the question remains, and the mystery of the origin of life is just that. It remains a great mystery, and that's part of why Frankenstein, I think, still speaks to us at a philosophical level of the sublime. However, if the materialists were correct, this would mean that one could create such a monster from scratch, if only Victor had those instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into this lifeless thing. But even the language here is an interesting mix. Instruments of life has that Enlightenment, Cartesian, mechanical ring to it, while the language of spark of being remains deeply occult. It's echoing Hermetic and Neoplatonic sentiments, all the while still being a nod to that novel theory of animal galvanism. And it seems the novel takes that very materialist view over the spiritual vitalism, especially in the second edition, as the very unworthy Victor is indeed able to summon life from death. Indeed, God is basically absent in Shelley's world. Now, just how much Shelley knew about the occult worldviews of Albertus Magnus, Cornelius Agrippa, the Kabbalist, or the Paracelsus is of some interest, but ultimately immaterial. But for what it's worth, Percy Shelley, her husband, did mention studying all three of these in that order in a letter to William Godwin, and even tried to summon a ghost at Eton, and Victor is probably at least in part based on Percy, so there's some connective tissue there. But leaving the animation of the monster largely to the imagination of the reader was clearly for the best, even if we don't really trust Victor's motives for not revealing his methods later on in the novel. But it's still fun to peer back into the world of the historical occult, the world of the emerging natural philosophy as science, and wonder, what exactly went on that dreary, rainy November night when Frankenstein's monster roared into our shared collective imagination? Of course, I've done deep dives on every occultist featured in this episode, and episodes on the origins of the Gothic as philosophy, introductions to magic, alchemy, Kabbalah, etc. here on the channel. It's kind of what we do here. So look around if you're interested. And again, you absolutely have to check out Atun Shay's fantastic video essay on Frankenstein. And of course, stick around for more on the occult and the development of early modern science. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.